Okay, just about ready to get started, everyone. All right, here we go. Hey, everyone, this is Achutabhava from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to start delving into Jupiter's movement into Pisces. So this week is sort of going to be dedicated to Jupiter's entrance and ingress into the sign of Pisces. We're going to do a bunch of different things. We're going to take a few deep dives into Jupiter and Pisces as we did last week with Saturn and Uranus and with Venus. So today we're going to be doing that by exploring some of the deeper philosophical implications and spiritual implications of Jupiter's movement into Pisces. But we'll also take Jupiter through all of the 12 whole sign houses based on your rising sign. Who knows, maybe Raph will come out again, see if I can't talk him into hanging out with us again this week. But we'll be flipping some tarot cards one way or another, and also looking at the astrological signatures based on Jupiter's position in your birth chart according to your rising sign. So we'll also be taking a look at the major astrology of January this week. I will not be doing sun and rising sign horoscopes for January because I'm producing such a massive amount of content for the Kickstarter this month, but there will be a January overview of the month that I'll be doing at the end of the week before the new year. So that being said, before we dive in today, I am really excited to say that we have 5 days left in the Kickstarter, and we are closing in on our goal. We are at 1,038 backers, which we achieved over the holiday weekend. Merry Christmas to everyone if you guys were celebrating. I hope you guys had a nice holiday. Right now, we are just a little over 300 backers shy of our goal with 5 days left to go. So we still need about 300 of those of you who enjoy this channel to pitch in and support it. I'm going to put the link into the live stream right now. Really appreciate your support if you're able to give it. You'll also find the link in the comments section of this post, as well as the description of this video. We need your help. I'm really banging the drum now. 300 backers we need about 320 backers about to reach our goal and break last year's record. We're trying to get to 1,367 backers. We're at 1,038 with 5 days left, just a little, almost 4 days left, but about 5 days. So between 5 and 4. So at any rate, I'm going to point you to the Kickstarter right now and tell you how you can also take advantage of the best deals that I offer, which include 50% off all of my online courses in 2022. So if you want to come study astrology with me in 2022, you can pick up the year 1 program, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic, for $900, which is 50% off the normal rate for the 1-year program. It is over 100 hours worth of classroom content. We have 12 guest speakers that come in, breakout study sessions, a discussion forum, tutoring staff. You can speak with me throughout the year and ask questions if you have them. Live webinars or recordings, tons of bonus material, optional homework, tutorials on how to use astrology software. I mean, it is a packed and loaded program. A lot of our students come out reading charts for other people. A lot of our students go on to take our year 2 program as well. So you can also bundle the courses together and save a lot more money. Basically, you get 2 courses for $1,700, which is the typical full cost of 1 program. Even if you're using the early bird rate that we run prior to the start of class, this is still $400 cheaper than the early bird rate, and that savings still goes up if you bundle year 1 and year 2 together. So a great way to save. You can bundle all 3 courses. We have 3 courses if you include horary, and I also have a 4th year program called Readings and Passages. So we have 4 years worth of deep dive into Hellenistic astrology curriculum available, and all of it's on sale through New Year's Eve. So you have to get it before midnight on New Year's Eve. You have just about 5 to 4 days. Like this afternoon, the little thing on Kickstarter will flip over to saying 4 days left. So we're just about to 4 days left. If you're not able to afford donating, there's lots of other things too, by the way, I should mention. A year ahead horoscope reading. So if you want a deep dive into all the major transits of the year for your rising sign or your sun sign, you can pick up that video. We have 12 different videos, one for every sign. And then there's also the Astrology of 2022 video. And that's a deep dive into all the astrology of 2022. And that also includes a calendar that we make that gives you the list of transits that I'll be tracking on my channel throughout the year. So that's kind of fun. And that's a $50 pledge. The year ahead horoscope reading you can get is a $100 pledge. So we try to say thank you for supporting this channel the best we can. Yeah, I'm really excited. We're just coming down the home stretch strong. I wasn't sure how we were going to do. We're right neck and neck where we were last year at this time. We're just about on the right pace, but we need to push really strong these last few days. So if you haven't pitched in yet, really appreciate your support. If you can't afford to pitch in, click the subscribe button, thumbs up the videos, share them, and click on the notifications bell so you can see when I go live. All that stuff helps. Your prayers help. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we can have a really strong showing here in the last few days. And thank you to everybody who's already donated. Okay, well, let's go on now to talk about Jupiter's movement into Pisces. So first things first, let's take a look at the astrology of it on the real-time clock, and then we'll be breaking this transit down and into pieces. I'm glad to be doing a live stream, by the way, and I'm really happy to be seeing where you're all coming from. I see some people coming from, looks like England, Phoenix, Florida, Indonesia, France, Croatia, Mexico City, Austin, Cincinnati, Greece. Yeah, I love it. Memphis, Tennessee, Malaysia, Massachusetts. So cool. It's so cool to see everyone. No, we're not selling the calendar is not available outside of the Kickstarter. None of these things are available outside of the Kickstarter. So yeah, if you want to save on the programs, it's only a deal that we honor through the Kickstarter. If you want to pick up the Astrology of 2022 video or your horoscope for the year ahead video or the calendar, we only do that through the Kickstarter. So at any rate, you can see on the screen right now, here's Jupiter culminating at the last degree of Aquarius. Now that ingress is going to happen December 28th, that's Tuesday, late in the evening, East Coast time, United States. But you could easily just say it's Tuesday into Wednesday that the transition of Jupiter from late Aquarius into Pisces occurs. And that's what we're going to be really taking a long look at this week, because it's a major movement. Jupiter really goes through, and a full sign of the zodiac is about a year for Jupiter. It takes about 12 to get around the entire zodiac. So it's a big deal when Jupiter changes signs. And in ancient astrology, when a planet ingresses into a new sign, the ingress of the planet into the new sign changes its dignity, how it's behaving based on which sign it's in and whose temple it's hanging out in. And it also changes based the topics that the planet will activate based on the new whole sign house and its new topics that it is entering. So all of a sudden, you're going to get a big shift in terms of what Jupiter is emphasizing in your life. So studying the ingresses are really important. Today, we're not going to be looking at the ingresses or the house movements. We'll be doing that later in the week. What we will be doing is taking a look at the deeper philosophical and archetypal dimensions of this transition. One of the key things to recognize is that for the past 2 years, we have had Jupiter in Capricorn and Jupiter in Aquarius, which are Saturn's domiciles. So Jupiter has been like a house guest in Saturn's temples for the past 2 years, with Saturn greatly empowered in those signs with a huge Saturn-Pluto conjunction that happened. Now we're seeing Jupiter getting into its own domicile, where it has much more of its own it's like being in your own house as opposed to being a guest in someone else's. Not that you hate being a guest, but you have all your own facilities in your house compared to being at the mercy of your host if you're, in a host's house. And Saturn is not always the easiest for Jupiter to get along with, although the great conjunction that they formed around December of 2020 suggested that there was some there's some cooperation happening between the two of those planets, which I think you can see Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions as the moment of a new beginning. Often they signal, for example, throughout history, regime changes in politics that are very substantial or that are historical for one reason or another. At any rate, Jupiter now changing into Pisces will be in the sign of Pisces all the way until about the middle of May. So let's take it forward now, and I just want to show you how this plays out. I'm just going to kind of quickly move this forward until we get to May. And here you can see on May 11th, this is the 10th into the 11th, you'll see Jupiter change signs into Aries, another one of the major ingresses of the year. Now you might be saying, well, wait, I thought Jupiter spends like a whole year in a sign. Well, because of retrogrades, the total amount it will spend will be a year, but it's not always all at once. So we had a little preview of Jupiter into Pisces last summer. Now we're going to get Jupiter going through the entire sign and into Aries. And then later in the year, Jupiter will actually come back into Pisces for just a little bit. So if we go forward a little bit further, you're going to see that Jupiter turns retrograde in like August and comes back to the sign of Pisces. Let's see, here it is. Just do it by the day. It's about October 27th, 28th, thereabouts. And then from late October, Jupiter will be back into Pisces all the way until about the month of December. And then it switches back into Aries right around the winter solstice. So you get a little like late October to December, Jupiter in Pisces is back, but its main transit of the year is from late December, as of December 28th and the 29th, all the way through about May 10th, thereabouts. So within that transit, one of the biggest transits of 2022, which I spent time breaking down in the Kickstarter video, by the way. This is the one that I really have my eye on, that it'll definitely be, well, spending a good amount of time talking about it, is Jupiter and Neptune's conjunction in Pisces, which happens in April. It also happens as Venus, exalted Venus, comes through. So remember that Jupiter is the domicile, or excuse me, Pisces is the domicile, feminine domicile of Jupiter, and also the feminine, the exaltation of feminine Venus. So you have this exalted place for Venus and Jupiter, the two benefics getting together with Neptune. This should be really pretty epic. This late April portion of the year also comes right as there is an eclipse in Taurus, where the moon is exalted in Venus's sign. There's a really nice uplifting feeling around the spring this year, as far as I can tell. So at any rate, that's one of the, maybe the most exciting portions of this Jupiter transit through Pisces that I'm really looking forward to personally. So that's just a little bit about the astrology of the Jupiter and Pisces time period from late December here through May, that I thought you guys would be interested to see before we dive into talking about this from the archetypal standpoint. What I really want to talk about is remember what Jupiter represents, first of all, and then how does Jupiter change how its significations are showing up in our lives based on moving into one of its home signs out of Saturn signs. I've talked about this a little bit already. I did a preview of this toward the end of November, but it's worth talking about again. Jupiter is the planet that is thought of as the bringer of cohesion. Now, mostly we see this in mundane astrology, as Jupiter will be connected to things like religious institutions, institutions of higher learning, governments, the courts, justice systems, anything that has around it the aura of being one of the institutions or aspects of society that holds everything together with some semblance of virtue or goodness, even if it's only ideally speaking. Of course, the world is constantly falling short of the ideal, right? But ideally, a justice system, ideally the courts, ideally the schools, ideally any institution that is supposed to provide some sense of social, moral, cosmic cohesion and order. This is Jupiter's territory. But what's so interesting about Zeus, Jupiter, the original name for the planet was Zeus. In the original sense, what's so interesting about this planet is the way that if we track Jupiter through the signs over the years, that it's whatever kind of justice or order or truth or sense of virtue and cohesion, whatever sense of piety or faith that Jupiter brings to our lives to grant some sense of order, it changes a great deal based on whose sign it's in. For example, when Jupiter later this spring moves into the sign of Aries, Jupiter's sense of justice and truth and order and cohesion and unity will be expressed through the lens of Mars, a cardinal fire sign, the sign of the ram and the god of war. And also, Aries is the exaltation of the sun. So you're going to have solar and martial qualities exalted, right? And Jupiter will be kind of like speaking to those things through its tendency to bring order. So it's like you know, I gave a talk recently talking about the just kind of the energy of Jupiter into Aries. I don't know who's from. It was for Opa, and one of the things I talked about was how Jupiter in Aries will bring the wisdom of the warrior, or it tends to emphasize that what brings order, cohesion, and where we place our faith is going to have something to do with concerns about honor, nobility, conflict, authority, what is good and what you should fight for. And Jupiter will be on about those things as soon as Jupiter enters Aries. So Jupiter's sense of what is good, what is noble, what holds everything together changes based on whose temple Jupiter is hanging out in. So in order to really understand what this particular transit is going to be about, we have to understand, well, what is Pisces about? And a couple of things that we can say right away about the sign of Pisces is that this is the double-bodied water sign of Jupiter. So it's Jupiter's home sign, but it's the feminine sign. Double-bodied water sign also means it's feminine. And it's also the exaltation of Venus. So this is the place where Venus is exalted. So Jupiter's way of knowing in its feminine sign is really distinct from the way that it knows, or the kind of the vision of unity or order or truth or moral cohesion that Jupiter brings when it's in Sagittarius, right? A fire sign where there is no exaltation ruler. So it's a really different kind of Jupiter. And a lot of people, when they think of Jupiter or Zeus, they're going to think of something that brings that formal sense of order. And they forget that Jupiter also has an incredibly feminine way of knowing, that Jupiter's feminine way of knowing is inherently Venusian. So what does that mean? Well, the Venusian way of knowing is it's erotic, it's imaginative, it's romantic, it's watery, it's feeling, it's sensitive. This is a totally different kind of vibe than we've been experiencing for the past couple of years, because with Jupiter in Saturn's signs, Jupiter is prone toward reason, for one thing, very rational in Aquarius, and principled and committed with the kind of a heaviness and a gravitas. And this also because Saturn we've talked about this recently, Saturn was the ruler of feigned appearances. So sometimes Saturn deals with melancholy. Saturn deals with restriction, isolation, depression. Saturn deals with basically an inherent feeling of emptiness by sometimes overcompensating with a kind of dogmatic rigidity, a disciplined, committed, principled heaviness. And it will overcompensate for an underlying sense of depression or meaninglessness or this kind of feeling of hollowness. And in order to address that, it'll say, well, I'm just going to be very strong and principled about things that I believe. And Jupiter, in one of the potential shadows, I'm not saying there haven't been virtues, but one of the potential shadows of Jupiter in Saturn signs for the past couple of years could have been this ideological rigidity, whether it's political, spiritual, psychological, relational, professional, that if we're feeling drained, if we're feeling tired, if we're feeling exhausted, I'd mentioned this last week, if there's an underlying sense of I don't care, then Jupiter in Saturn's signs overcompensates and says, well, no, I care tremendously, but in this sometimes very, white-knuckled, overly committed, dogmatic, rigid kind of way. that would be a shadow of Jupiter in Saturn signs, especially Jupiter in its fall in Capricorn a couple of years ago. And one of the ways that we also, you just have to be careful when Jupiter is in Saturn signs that we don't become narrow, sectarian. Those are some of the and literalistic, taking everything so literally, and forgetting things like nuance. Saturn was the ruler in ancient astrology of the opposition in terms of the aspect categories. The opposition was of the nature of Saturn. And so we have to be very careful because Saturn is prone towards building walls between things, what is in and what is out of the city, who is popular and who is marginalized. Saturn is a planet that announces those distinctions. It's not that Saturn is an oppressor. It's that Saturn represents the boundary between those with power and those without. Saturn tends to amplify the distinction between people at the top of a power structure and people at the bottom, because Saturn tends to amplify polarities of all kinds. For example, a lot of the times you'll see Saturn, in very positive terms associated with people who separate themselves from the world. There's another polarity, right? The world, and I'm separate or apart from it. So there's a boundary between a person who lives in the mountain and sits and contemplates or meditates on the truth of all things that transcend human life in the city. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but they have to be able to see something apart from or other than or outside of the immersion in city life. And so Saturn represents those contemplatives who go off to libraries or mountaintops to get away from the world, separate themselves. So separation is a key word for Saturn. So Jupiter, who's supposed to bring cohesion in a sign that is inherently about separation. Now, sometimes people think separation is a bad thing. And what I'm trying to say right now is that it's not necessarily a bad thing. But one of the shadows of separation, of course, is that you get Jupiter in Saturn sign, and the way you create cohesion is through separation. This is my belief, and the vaxxed and the unvaxxed, the right wings and the left wings, whatever. This kind of thing becomes really, really amplified. And frankly, we've had a lot of that for a long time with Pluto in one of Saturn's signs. And we're going to get a lot more of it with Pluto going through Saturn's next sign of Aquarius, starts ingressing into Aquarius in 2023. So don't think this is going anywhere, right? It's a long stretch of Saturnine energy that we're dealing with by outer planetary transits and so forth. So, but to give some ray of hope, it is tremendously good news that Jupiter is moving out of Saturn-ruled signs, because now we're going to get a contrasting vibration. It's not all Saturn any longer. We're going to start to see a lot of energy picking up around Jupiter's feminine sign. Now, when I say that Jupiter brings all of this, places such an emphasis on order and unity and so forth, there's something about that initially that when I hear that, it just doesn't sound like hopeful. It's like, well, that doesn't really capture my spirit. Oh, good. Jupiter will bring my faith back and, create some, restore some sense of order, unity. It's like Jupiter doesn't sound like a particularly inspiring planet in that regard. When you think of Jupiter as government, education, schools, religions, which is Jupiter is actually a lot more formal. In modern astrology, people are like, oh, Jupiter, expansion, right? In ancient astrology, Jupiter's associated with growth and fertility and abundance. And so expansion is an appropriate word. But Jupiter is much more throughout the history of astrology associated with that sense of social, moral, cosmic order and unity, with a sense of everything in its right place, and there being some kind of some semblance of social or civic cohesion, right? So it doesn't really sound inspiring, it's like, ugh. So, I mean, there's a lot of Saturn energy. I think what people are also looking for is a different kind of experience, one that's not necessarily as geared toward the social or civic fabric or order or disintegration, etc. Not that, I mean, that's going to take place anyway. What strikes me when I listen to my clients and when I just talk to people throughout the year and students and people on social media is that it feels like what people are really looking for is renaissance. The word renaissance, of course, means rebirth. And to be reborn is essentially an emotional experience, not an experience that's all about the rational cosmic order, which Zeus, to be completely honest, is usually more associated with. Now, I like the way that Zeus is associated with those things a lot better when Zeus is out of Saturn ruled signs, but still. So what I want to say about Jupiter in Pisces is that I think this is really hopeful, not so much because of what Jupiter brings, but because of what Jupiter brings when it's in its feminine sign, when it's in its water sign, and when it's in a sign that exalts Venus. This is what we really have to look forward to, is that Jupiter's feminine expression is so beautiful and so much more than the kind of rational order keeping that you might typically think of with Zeus. Again, remember that Jupiter is going to provide us with a new epistemology, which means not just addressing the social or political landscape, but Jupiter in Pisces will address our way of knowing what is true or what is real. And it will do so from the standpoint of exalting Venusian qualities, exalting feminine qualities, and sort of exalting watery qualities, and changeability and movement as a real feature of the double-bodied nature of Pisces. So this is exciting. And so today I said there are 3 keys to Venus's sort of watery fish way of knowing. Remember that the fish, really interesting thing about the constellation image of the fish that Pisces is associated with, you have one fish in the constellation that's moving upward and eastward, and the other one that's moving downward and westward, and their tails are tied together. Or sometimes you see them sort of depicted as swimming in a circle with their tails tied together, and or connected somehow by a thread. So this really speaks to a couple of different things. One is that there is that time. I've said this many and different occasions. As Plato said, time is the moving image of eternity. There's something about this double-bodied water sign of Pisces that brings Jupiter's way of knowing into a more timeless, romantic, and imaginative dimension. It's a way of knowing that is less time-bound. It's more circular. It's more fluid. It's more exploratory. It's more erotic. It's more subtle. It's more nuanced. It's impressionistic. And that way of knowing and that way of seeking cohesion is much more deeply psychological and much more personal in nature in many ways than it is collective. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But there are 3 basic ways that I wrote down that we're going to talk about today that Jupiter in Pisces has of approaching truth and knowledge and reality, a different way of seeing and understanding. And in these qualities, I think we will find the kind of emotional renaissance that I think a lot of people are craving right now. One is called reflection, and the second is called silvering, and the third is called silence. So we're going to talk about those 3 in particular. And as we go, we're going to also talk about why this Jupiter in particular in these 3 steps can also help us go beyond 2 things that I think get overly associated with Jupiter and can be a really big bummer, and that is ideology and self-help. So we're also going to talk about how these 3 things associated with Jupiter and Pisces help us to go beyond just the kind of blandness of self-help programming that's out there, and also beyond the traps of ideology. And I'm not here to completely discard the importance of ideology or self-help, but I think Jupiter in Pisces is a period of time this year where we have an opportunity to sort of go beyond those things. And I think that's something that the soul craves, is to go beyond, instructions for improvement and becoming better. And also the soul goes beyond needing social, civic, cultural ideologies to like live by and feel we need a different kind of nourishment sometimes, basically. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the enemies of Jupiter and Pisces' way of knowing. And I've got some texts that I'm going to pull from as we go. So let's start by talking about reflection. There was a book that was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. I think it was in 79, 81, something like that. Anyway, it was called Revisioning Psychology by James Hillman. And he's my favorite author pretty much ever. But I'm going to read you a section in his book that is called Seeing Through. This is called The Process of Seeing Through. And this comes as the first step. You could call it reflection, or you could call it seeing through. And this is something that I think is right in line with what Jupiter in Pisces brings to us as a way of knowing, as a way of experiencing, and as a way of bringing some sense of unity into our lives. So here's what he writes. The process of seeing through. Let us now condense the process of psychological discovery into a series of steps. First of all, I'm going to be breaking down some of this as we go. What does he mean by psychological discovery? Psychological discovery for him does not mean understanding things about your behavior, which you can then make more conscious or somehow go and fix through diagnosis or mindfulness or some kind of remedy. Psychological discovery for James Hillman meant that you discover psyche. Psyche means soul. So psychological discovery means that you are getting in touch with soul. And that does not mean that you're accomplishing something. It means you're getting to know someone. It's a relational step. It's a relational, you could say it's a process of relational discovery. So when he says psychological discovery, that's what he means. He means founding or creating relationship with soul in yourself, but also in the world. Because Hillman, like the ancient philosophers who studied astrology, believed that the cosmos itself was an ensouled being, and like a cosmic animal. First, there is the psychological moment. For him, that is the soul moment. A moment of reflection, wonder, puzzlement, initiated by the soul, which intervenes and countervails what we are in the midst of doing, hearing, reading, watching. With slow suspicion or sudden insight, we move through the apparent to the less apparent. We use metaphors of light, a little flicker, a slow dawning, a lightning flash as things become clarified. When the clarity has itself become obvious and transparent, there seems to grow within it a new darkness, a new question or doubt, requiring a new act, requiring a new act of insight, penetrating again toward the less apparent. The movement becomes an infinite regress, which does not stop at coherent or elegant answers. The process of psychologizing cannot be brought to a halt at any of the resting places of science or philosophy or ideology. That is, psychologizing is not satisfied when necessary and sufficient conditions have been met, or when testability has been established. It is satisfied only by its own movement of seeing through, moving from outside in. It is a process of interiorizing, moving from the surface of visibilities to the less visible. It is a process of deepening, moving from the data of impersonal events to their personification. It is a process of subjectivizing. Psychologizing justifies itself as we penetrate or try to bring out, expose, or show why we believe that what lies behind or within is truer and more real, powerful, or valuable than what is evident. It is a justification in terms of depths. We justify the activity by appealing to an ultimate hidden value that can never fully come out, but must remain concealed in the depths in order to justify the movement. This ultimate hidden value justifying the entire operation can be called the hidden God who only appears in concealment. This phenomenon before us is a narrative. A tale is told of it in metaphors of history or physical causality or logic. We tell ourselves something in the language of because. The immediate is elaborated by fantasy so that a metamorphosis occurs as the immediate becomes part of an account. It is a process of mythologizing, and all explanations whatsoever may be regarded as narrative fantasies and examined as myths. So that is Hillman describing what it means to be psychologically reflective, which is to say what it means to reflect upon things in a way that is constantly bringing out the hidden God within, which is constantly bringing out psyche or soul from within. And the justification for doing so is that it feels good to be in touch with, in relationship with your soul. That's it. And that the ability to continue this process of reflection, both upon yourself, but also upon the world, upon events, upon things, upon people, upon places, upon relationships, upon conversations, upon words, upon sounds, upon nature, that this reflection process is never ending and justifies itself because it is a relationship. So, just like you don't say that there's a goal with you and your lover making love, not really, right? Because the goal should be the ongoing unfolding of continued intimacy, and that we don't get that. You can't get that unless there's some way in which it's bottomless, right? There's some way in which there's always something new, something different. So psychologizing, or a life of reflection, is essentially feminine in nature, you could say, in terms of our sort of masculine feminine binary in ancient metaphysics. It's feminine insofar as it has to do with subjective, relational, interiorizing, a process-oriented approach. It has to do with gaining some sense of clarity, but not so that you can apprehend or hold that clarity, but specifically so that it can disappear again and invite you back in to continue exploring, to continue subjectivizing and interiorizing. Listen to what he says one more time. First, there is the psychological moment. Let's call it the soul moment, a moment of reflection, wonder, puzzlement, initiated by the soul, which intervenes and countervails what we are in the midst of doing, hearing, reading, watching. And this is the important part. With slow suspicion or sudden insight, we move through the apparent to the less apparent. We use metaphors of light, a little flicker, a slow dawning, a lightning flash as things become clarified. When the clarity has itself become obvious and transparent, there seems to grow within it a new darkness, a new question or doubt, requiring a new act of insight, penetrating again toward the less apparent. The movement becomes an infinite regress which does not stop at coherent or elegant answers. The process of psychologizing cannot be brought to a halt at any of the resting places of science or philosophy. That is, psychologizing is not satisfied when necessary, sufficient conditions have been met or when testability has been established. It is satisfied only by its own movement of seeing through. So when we apply that to our lives as astrologers, for example, or people who are interested in astrology, you hear me mirroring this approach all of the time, because I will say something like, part of how we grow as astrologers is, rather than interpreting everything we're saying only in terms of what can it do for me, how can I improve, how can I manipulate the energies of this week, or make my amulet that harnesses this energy and gives me something that I want or that I don't want, or protects me, blah, 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 blah. All of that stuff, right? Fine and dandy. Essentially, and I really do mean that. There's nothing wrong with any of that, right? But also, when we're thinking of reality as a relationship, right? then we have to remember that part of being in this reality should be relationally oriented, which means it privileges subjective, ongoing relating of self to other. So that means that as events come pouring into our lives, we study astrology so that we can reflect upon them using the archetypes, using the symbols, that we can reflect upon them. And then that reflecting deepens our relationship with reality, with each other, with ourselves, with experience itself. For ancient astrologers, that was one part of what it meant to spiritualize your life, right? But that, in a sense, you could say that's a very watery path, right? So it's not surprising, for example, that in my ninth house, the place of higher knowledge and truth, that I have the moon, right? It's a very feminine planet in that house. So I'm I'm interested in bhakti yoga, which is ultimately a very feminine form of yoga, you could say as well. There's many paths out there, don't get me wrong. But Jupiter in Pisces, in my mind, presents us specifically with reminders about the archetypal yin, or the feminine's way of knowing, the feminine's way of relating, the feminine's goals, you could even say, if not even the right word. But if you had to say it's a goal, then metaphysically, its goal is not a goal, it's a relationship. So one of the things that, if we want to lead a psychological life, which is to say a soulful life, and to experience the inherent, we'll call it divinity of within all things, the soulfulness of all things, including the cosmos itself, we have to develop a reflective way of knowing, of approaching knowledge, which is, in a reflective way, means a relational way. When you reflect upon something, you're allowing it to come into you, right? And as you reflect upon it and it comes into you, you come into it. So, and so as that process of knowing occurs, what it does is, as soon as you've understood something based on that, you realize that the understanding you've received has been achieved through a relationship. And as soon as there's a relationship and there's another living presence, the opportunity to continue knowing each other presents itself. Because we are eternal souls, there is no beginning or end to the capacity to know one another, to love one another, to, come to experience each other. So, do you ever come to the end of feeling like don't relationships start breaking and falling apart when we say we've grown apart? There's the intimacy is gone, the spark is gone. I'm bored, whatever. Well, that usually means that you've stopped knowing one another and loving the process of getting to know one another. And there's lots of reasons, legitimate reasons, that we get stuck in that, right? But probably therapists, regardless of what their perspective was, would say over and over again, it's very important that you keep intimacy alive in your relationships. Otherwise, they grow stagnant, and so on and so forth. So one of the problems that we have in this world is that rather than dealing with stagnation, through ongoing practices of reflective living, which is to say relational living, we look for things that will temporarily fix what amounts to a broken relationship with reality. We don't know how to be relational beings. Some of that boils down to selfishness. Some of it boils down to lack of imagination. Some of it boils down to the inability to listen or stay curious, right? But that's a problem that we all have, is we look for very quick fixes that we think will take care of whatever we feel that is lacking, when oftentimes the thing that's lacking is we don't know how to be in a reflective relationship with ourselves, with events, with experience, with others. There's not a goal behind reflective living. There's relationships. We sometimes honestly, it's easy to, relationships can be exhausting. And so, but then a lot of the times we also don't realize that, when I'm exhausted from relationships, it's usually because I haven't tended the relationship with myself deeply enough. Because if you have, and you're tending to your own soul, and the relationship with the indwelling self, which the Vedas describe like there's two birds sitting on a branch within every heart, and that there's an internal relationship, in other words, as well. And that if that relationship is doing well, that the soul's natural inclination is to a relationship with others. So sometimes if you're also feeling exhausted by relationships, a lot of that may also stem from not tending to the interior relationship, right? Anyway, the first step to understanding Jupiter in Pisces is to embrace a reflective and relational way of experiencing, seeing life. It's a different kind of epistemology. It privileges different kinds of results. The result is not one where you say, I've arrived somewhere, I've understood something. And it's also, you shouldn't feel frustrated by that either. It kind of is like, it's like sort of like saying that we're so focused on metaphysically, our souls are so focused on orgasm that we've forgotten that the real pleasure is in just about everything else that leads up to it, probably even more so. So there's orgasmic moments in our relationships with reality where we come away with some understanding or feel we've arrived somewhere, or like we've grasped something, or we have a moment where we feel we've reached a peak. But what Hillman was saying in that text is that those moments where you suddenly, it feels like you've discovered something, they go away really quickly. They go away again. But an enlightened soul, a soul that has psychological richness, is not frustrated by that, because they're like, oh, we get to do this more and again and in new ways and in different ways. I'm not frustrated by that. It's like reality has a built-in erotic tension by it, and you're either driven mad by it, like an itch that you can't scratch, or it becomes the source of unending pleasure. And it really seems to depend on how if each person is willing to see that. You need a kind of you need a weird kind of patience for it. You have to develop a taste for it on some level, that reality is like an erotic lover that is as frustrating and teasing. And there's a dance, you're being rejected constantly and held at arm's length and grasping to understand, and then suddenly being let in and having epiphanies, but this kind of tension is cyclical, and over time, the more we participate in it, the more it becomes blissful. So that's a feminine way of knowing. That's Jupiter in Venus's exaltation. That's Jupiter in the sign of the fish, the ever moving fish, the fish that moves upward and eastward toward realization, toward enlightenment, toward the goal, toward the orgasm, right? And the one that moves downward and westward. Let's go back into the maze. Let's go back into the confusion. Let's go back into the chaos. Let's lose ourselves. Let's struggle to understand. Let's move into an interiorizing space where we're reflecting upon something, but nothing's clear. So these two forces are always moving with one another, with this subtle romantic tension, and Jupiter and Pisces can help us to be uplifted by this. These are the waters of rebirth, right? This is what's meant, I think, by the word rebirth and Renaissance. Why is it that the Renaissance in Western culture, there's Renaissances in many different places in the world, in different cultures, it doesn't always mean the Greek Renaissance that we've experienced in sort of Western culture tradition in general. But why would the Renaissance, the word rebirth, always involve the bringing back of the polytheistic Greek imagination, filled with gods, teeming with a universe whose math is art and art is science and science is music and music are the gods? And why? Right? Because we feel dead when we don't live in a universe that is inherently filled with all of these, fascinating, soap operas of divinity. We need them. The soul is just hungry for them. So, okay. Step 2 for Jupiter and Pisces way of knowing. The first one is reflection, a life of reflection. The second one is silvering. Silvering. There's an essay that Hillman wrote called Silver and the White Earth. As you can tell, I've been reading a lot of Hillman again lately. I started reading Hillman again over the summer as Jupiter went into Pisces, by the way, without any plan. And then I realized, this is very much in line with just the way he thought. He's talking now about the alchemy of how lead, Saturn, is changed into silver, the moon, but you could also think of the moon just generally as the feminine. The protection of lead and the release of silver. This is from an essay he wrote called Silver and the White Earth. The protection of lead and the release of silver from lead as a white dove indicates the precious and noble nature attributed to silver. A whiteness with the wings of a dove can emerge from a leaden state that seems completely to enclose it. The dull, heavy heart of lead conceals a dove of silver. To extract it, we need dry heat and vinegar. Silver does not come forth easily, and, quote, a ton of smelted lead usually contains only a few ounces of silver. The release of the dove does not separate it from its weightiness, that gravitas of the spirit. It carries lead into its silver. Imagine the lead becoming winged, mobile, airborne, hovering over the operations with serious attentiveness, as a dove with outspread wings stays suspended over a scene in medieval icons. The spirit no longer caught in immanence only, immersed in laborious struggles with the dull and dense. Lead is the metal of Saturn. Cold, heavy, dense was not used widely before Roman times. Like silver, it was not technically as practical as were iron and copper, so that both lead and silver, like Saturn and the moon, were more otherworldly, religious, and mystical. He goes on and says, depression is the price of silver. Melancholy has, ever since Aristotle's Problemata, been the disease of thinkers. The more white reflection, the more burdened lead. As we produce silver, we increase the lead. This is surely familiar, and insight may be shining in itself, but it makes no dent on the gray mood from which it came. We have the feeling of lead poisoning, a state of being swallowed by lead, lost in the lead mine. It's all so long and slow. What use, we feel, these silver mirrorings, this trickle of light, if the caughtness of depression does not lift? The truth, however, is that depression is the mine. This is the lead necessary for the silver, even if the silver is neither useful nor functional in altering the lead. We mine silver from lead, but not to do away with the lead, for that would close down the mine. Here we must remember the curious metallurgic fact that silver corrupts in air. It tarnishes. It converts with the chlorides in rainwater so that it is naturally found mainly in argentiferous lead ores. Only very rarely can silver be found unalloyed under the earth in mountainous regions. Silver blackens in air and cannot always gleam as gold. Silver requires polishing, attention, a bit of rubbing and fussing. It calls for worry. Goes on to say, by brain here, I mean, of course, the metaphorical brain, the subtle brain, the brain of the fantasy world, as well as the bodies of brain fantasies. Fantasies, in other words, whatever their nature, contain silver. This silvered brain presents itself in descriptions of silver fantasy forms. For instance, the reign of the moon lasts just 3 weeks, but before its close, the substance exhibits a great variety of forms. It will become liquid and again coagulate 100 times a day. Sometimes it will present the appearance of fish's eyes, and then again of tiny silver trees with twigs and leaves. Whenever you look at it, you will have cause for astonishment, particularly when you see it all divided into beautiful but very minute grains of silver. This is the white tincture. These shapes and patterns, these variegated filigrees, are a way to find silver. In the bits and grains and swimming sparkles of reflection, dream fragments and tinsely fantasies, twigs of branching thoughts 100 times a day, the interlaced connections marked by the interior our awareness resonating in our throats as the whitening mind emerges in the night. Silver comes in the shape of fantasy. It can be mined from our brain's projected, imagined figurations. Silver as the metal of imaging indicates that imaging itself may be the mode of mining silver and whitening the brain. And remember this last line I'm going to repeat. Silver requires polishing, attention, a bit of rubbing and fussing. It calls for worry. I want to tell you a story. It's an embarrassing story, but I think you guys will get the point. And I hate to just draw on like stereotypical, like, male-female dynamics or, like men-women dynamics in marriages or whatever, but I have to, the story is my example. So I hope it resonates for at least a few people. What is silvering? We went on Christmas Eve to this thing in St. Paul, Minnesota called the Glow Festival. It's held at the state fairgrounds in St. Paul. We went there with my kids, my wife and I, my mom and her partner. So we went around, and I, in just very typical sort of yang fashion, was like, look at this thing. Let's go do this thing. This looks like fun. Let's go accomplish this thing. That will be a fun memory. Like, just like, that's my goal. Let's go do this thing. And it was very, very hard to get anything accomplished because it was cold outside. It was kind of, it had melted, snow had melted a little bit, and it was kind of muddy. And my two kids were fussing a lot about all sorts of different things. And I was getting so frustrated because to move from point A to point B, which could be like 10 feet, just felt like it was taking an hour because of all of the modifications. You guys might remember I have a song that I sing that is also very reflective of this, in my mind, very male, masculine impatience. I dance around singing this modification song because it's fussing with the gloves, then it's fussing with my drink, then it's my drink spilled, then it's, she's pulling my hair or whatever, there's all of these things. And my wife, double Taurus, right? Just so lunar, so Venusian, Cancer rising, right? And she's just so gently fussing and polishing and caring and concerning and worrying, not like in an obsessive, fearful manner, but in a careful, thoughtful manner, always. And I had this moment while we were walking through the fair and the lights were on, and I was getting just really impatient because I was like, look at all the joyful things, and we're fussing over their gloves. You put their glove on, they take it off, they're cold, they need this and blah, 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 all these adjustments. And I had this moment of catching myself, thank God, before I went into like my controlling, frustrated, like, let's move mode, I caught myself, and I had been rereading Alchemical Psychology. And I was thinking, it's easy to criticize people in your mind when you're an astrologer, like, oh my God, the Cancerian fuss, and I'm a Cancer sun. So I get it or whatever, but I'm like, and then I just had this moment where I remembered James Hillman saying that when silver hits the air, it starts to tarnish. So you have to polish it. You have to fuss over it. You have to care. It requires worry. It requires some level of concern. And I all of a sudden realized it was just like this kind of like just moment of epiphany. Just like in reflecting upon the nature of events, sometimes something emerges and you just see it suddenly and then it disappears again. So thank God I made that move to reflect a little bit on what was happening, that Venus was conjoined with Pluto, and that I could literally take a dump all over our Christmas Eve glow festival if I got too crabby. And suddenly I heard that quote about care and fussing and worrying over things. And I realized that my wife not only does this with our daughters and is such a patient mother and such a caring mother, but that she does this with her herbs. She does this in her garden. She does this over things she cooks. She does this over teas that she makes. She does this over gifts that she gives to people. Like, she'll wrap gifts herself and put them in boxes and send them to people thoughtfully. And all of a sudden, it just hit me that what she's doing is exactly like that. She has this very lunar, silver, feminine way of caring about this. She doesn't care about the ride that I want to go on. She doesn't care about if we go do all of the fun things because we only have a certain amount of time. She just cares that every step along the way, every little thing is done with a certain amount of devotion and sweetness and attention. Sometimes maybe she worries too much. I don't want to, I'm not trying to make her into a saint, although I think she is one most of the time, but you get what I'm saying? So that's silvering. Silvering is a way of caring for and sort of polishing and fussing over small things in the little cracks and crevices of life every day. Concern with beauty, concern with harmony, concern with grace and adaptability, and that the presence of psyche, of soulfulness, that in order to keep it in the air, it requires this kind of tending that's very constant. And so I had a moment of psychological reflection while at this state fairground that led me to be like, how it is when you have that moment where you see something about your partner and you are able to see it before your own bad habit kicks in. And anyway, I just thought, not only is this a moment, is she silvering and polishing things, and does she do that? And then I saw my mother doing it with her throughout the evening, and while me and her partner were like kind of just, tottering down the street being like, I guess we're not going to do anything, So, but we did do stuff and it was fun. But not only did I see that, but I also realized that if I can reflect upon my wife and my relationship with her and what's happening, that it had delivered this very amazing, brilliant little insight, which then disappeared again right away. But those in that moment, that's intimacy growing in me, in my relationship with my wife, because I took the time to reflect. And it was just such a simple moment where I just realized so many things that Hillman had been talking about, which I've been reading recently. So the first one, a life of reflection. The second one, a life of fussing over things, a life of careful concern over things, knowing that if you want the dull, saturnine, leaden stuff of the world to become something more, that you have to move from a space of trying to deal with it as literal problems that need literal solving. Like, okay, we got to do something fun for Christmas. So we go to this thing and we do these things. And then that solves the problem of not having something to do, that there's something subtler, there's something more nuanced, and there's something about giving small care wherever you go that suddenly makes the whole world sparkle, like with the reflective quality of the moon. This world can be dead matter, or it can be a reflection of eternity. And one of the ways it reflects with eternity is that nothing can be taken for granted. No small thing can be taken for granted. This is why sometimes people will find that double-bodied signs, especially Virgo and Pisces, they tend to fuss over things a lot, worry about things a lot, get caught up in things a lot. But we should all be so lucky to get caught up in things, with some nuance and care, such that the world, in all of the most mundane, everyday sense, can glow. So the third one is silence. And if I can find it, this is something that Hillman wrote about silence. With this, we come to speak of silence. To speak of it in Kyoto is a joke. This place is the very embodiment of silence. The temples and shrines, the gardens, the stones, the practices of Zen, the theater of No. Can silence be spoken of at all? Would we not better sit quietly or simply pick up and calmly walk away? Yet, to not speak of silence is a mistaken literalism. It is a denial, a positive act of negation. Silence is more than a negative act, such as holding the tongue still, a soundless stillness. Rather, silence refers to a quality of mind and works much like laughter. It is a mode not merely of being in the world and companionship with the world, but most importantly, of appreciating the world. Silence lets the world in. It softens the membrane that maintains the world outside. Silence expands outward into the world towards the soundlessness of inarticulate things. By this, I mean not merely stones and trees or, quote, dumb animals, but the silence that is part of all being and is covered over by articulation. We say that the wind has died down, a perfectly still day. We say that the sea is calm tonight, not a ripple. When all sound has ceased, when the silence appears not as an absence, a mute, dumb negativity, but rather the fullness of the presence of the sea is such, of windless air is such, the pregnancy of their silence. That pregnancy draws us into nature, woods, lakeside, meadows, the possibility to feel the full force of silence and to hear into nature's own language. Before shrines were built on mountains, before stones were carved into statues, silence was already felt already present in the mountains and the stone. Is silence another word for the Japanese kami divinities, the presence of sacred power? Does the Buddha's statues and the masters who teach in that discipline and other religious and spiritual disciplines attempt to embody silence? He goes on, it's a beautiful essay on silence, but silence is the last one. I agree with him that sometimes people will say, well, to really speak about silence is defeating the point. But it's not that silence is just a negative and something that you should try to positively assert, like positively asserting a negation. I will remain quiet because only by being quiet will I achieve a goal. No, not that kind of silence. The silence that creates space for relating, the silence that lets the other in, the silence that lets the world show forth. That kind of silence can be embodied in the pace with which we speak, in the tone, the word choice, the way that we actively listen, even as we speak. Shamans in the Amazon are known for this. Their ability to listen to the sound of their own voice is a part of how they perfect their ikaros, their musical medicine that comes from the plants. So listening is, while speaking, is part of what singers, songwriters, poets, all kinds of creative people have to do. They have to be able to hear themselves as they speak, which means there has to be a co-present silence even as something is being articulated. Silence is something that we experience in so many different ways. There is silence is multidimensional. In fact, in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 10, verse 38, Krishna says, of secret things, I am silence. Secret things, I am silence. That's a beautiful way of thinking about silence, that there are things that come forth in silence, and that Krishna is that secret thing that comes forth in the silence. There are enemies of these ways of knowing. I'm not going to say much more about silence, but a few words did feel appropriate. Silence is something that also helps us embody this different way of knowing. The enemies of this way of knowing, of reflection, silvering, and silence are problem solving and pathologizing. This is wrong, fix it this way. There's a place for all of these things too. Please don't misunderstand me. We live in a complex reality where many things are all true at once. But this way of knowing is often, the reflection, the silvering, and the silence are often killed by thinking about problems and thinking about solutions to problems in very literal ways, pathologizing and remedies. That's why I titled this video Beyond Self-Help, because this way of knowing doesn't see the symptoms of pain and suffering as just problems to be solved. They see them as the ground for intimacy, for knowing and for experiencing, and for something to come forth that reveals itself in those things. So problem solving, pathologizing, healing, not that healing is bad, but that if there's like I'm hurt, I'm broken, and I need redemption and healing, this can kill the imaginative and relational way of knowing, in the same way that my wife doesn't really like it if she sits down with a problem and I try to mansplain some kind of solution to her. She really doesn't like that. I've learned over time in astrology, in reading for people, that people like to be heard, and that sometimes offering solutions are helpful. But, or very early on in my career, as I got my own readings, I really didn't appreciate when I went into a reading and it felt like self-help coaching. I've always appreciated people who had a way of illuminating symbols and drawing me into my chart, into my soul. And so this is not necessarily a problem-solving, healing, self-help kind of way of knowing, I don't think. It's not The enemy of this way of knowing may be heroism, in the similar vein, where there's a problem to be solved and rise up and conquer it. Problems, an ideology as well, where most of our concern is with civil, social, religious, something, righteousness, the right thing versus the wrong thing. Not that there's place for ideology, there's a place for political involvement and so forth. But this way of knowing is not as much about this is the social, civic, political problem, and here's the solution, and or religious problem, and here's the solution. Because in ideology, there's not a lot of space for reflection. There's not a lot of space for care and curiosity, or nuance and paradox. There's not a lot of space for it. Monistic thinking that tries to collapse diversity and the subjective variances and variegatedness into onenesses. So be careful about oneness things taking over many things. They're both present, right? One in the many, but this is a bit more about the many as a way of knowing, or the path goes through the many to the one rather than the one being dominant, you could even say. This is talking without saying anything. That talking without saying anything is an enemy of this way of knowing. That if we're speaking, but there's nothing that's being said, there's nothing that's coming forth that feels relationally and emotionally evocative, that can be an enemy. Talking without saying anything, or speaking without listening as we're speaking, all of this can be sort of an enemy of this way of knowing. I'm going to end with something the Tao Te Ching says. Verse 37, when there is silence, one finds peace. And then this verse, my favorite, when there is silence, one finds the anchor of the universe within themselves. And so there's this weird way in which when we allow space and then we find a relationship, and there's something that comes forth. And remember that the metaphysical way of understanding the yin, or a double-bodied water sign, is less about energy moving from the center outward like a centrifugal force, and it's more like energy pooling down like waters coming into a pond where there's a whole ecosystem living somewhere within, and we're looking to interiorize things. Just like I realized that one of the reasons that my wife has such a deep, I have a great relationship with my kids, but my wife's relationship is so deep and nuanced and variegated with the girls compared to my own. And I'm always working on that, but she's a mom. And one of the things that I'm learning from her over time is just to polish and care and get in there with all of the little things. And that builds intimacy in a way that, I strive to be like that. Right. So at any rate, I hope you guys enjoyed all the stories today, and just this reflection on Jupiter into the double-bodied water sign of the fish, and the exaltation of Venus, the goddess. And hopefully this has done something to speak to those qualities today creatively. So I hope that you guys have a great day. If you haven't pitched in yet to support the Kickstarter, please do. I really need your support. We need about 300 plus backers yet to go. The link is in the description of this video, as well as in the comments section. I hope you guys have a beautiful day, and excited to bring in the